Hello, Mark.
Hello, Erica.
Oh, great. Okay, so you've been made co-host then, I assume.
Yep.
All right. We still have a few people coming in. I'm not sure. Amir said, should we give them a few moments, or do you prefer to go ahead and start? Or Mark, I'm not sure if you have a preference. Do you prefer to go ahead and start, or should we let a few more people join?
There's a little comment in there. I'm not able to unmute myself. You're in.
Oh, I see.
One. If you're host, you can.
Yeah, we'll give them a minute or so.
Okay.
I think that's the advice from the Uzbekistan office.
Yeah. I'll just pop a note in the chat.
All right, it's just 5 past the hour, so I think we might as well go ahead and get started. We've got a lot of material to cover today. I know for those that were here last week, we did cover a lot of detail around the Ielts writing, and I'm sure it will be no different this week for the focus on Ielts speaking. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand over to my colleague Mark to get us started this morning.
Thank you, Erica. Okay. You've got the controls, yep?
Yep.
Okay, so today's session is going to be looking at speaking. We're going to be focusing on speaking in the same way that we did in previous sessions. So again, we're joined by myself, my colleague Erica, and our colleague Dr. Joanna Motteram. And throughout the session, while we focus on speaking, we'll be drawing upon our experience as trainers, as teachers, as former examiners, to try to give you a better insight into really understanding how speaking is assessed. So today, what we're going to be doing is understanding the tasks that were presented, the skills that are targeted, and the characteristics of effective communication. It's important to remember IELTS is a test, but it's assessing or it's testing somebody's ability to communicate rather than pass an exam. So to do that, we're going to understand the band descriptors for speaking. By understanding what they're looking at, we can then think about how do we apply those band descriptors? How do you as teachers, or how do you as trainers, or even as a learner, apply those criteria to assessing speaking? So in our very first session, Dr. Joanna looked at these overall bands that we can consider. So a band 5 is what we would regard as a modest user. Basically, a person is able to partially command with the language. They can cope with the general understanding in most situations. They're likely to make mistakes, but they are able to handle or control basic communication in their own field. Overall, for a band 6, we're describing that person as a competent user. So they have effective command of language. They may make some inaccuracies here and there. Maybe it's an inappropriate usage or there's misunderstandings, but they can, reasonably or fairly handle fairly well some complex language, particularly if it's in more familiar situations. When we move up to this band 7, we're describing this person as a good user. And that's because they have an operational command of language. They may make some occasional inaccuracies. There may be some inappropriate usage or some misunderstandings in some situations. But generally, they're able to handle complex language as well as understand some really detailed reasoning, and especially if it's in a familiar field. Again, like previous sessions we mentioned, even at a band 7, somebody might make a mistake. All right, yeah, we can go on, Erica. So the speaking marking criteria. Again, we're going to be looking at 4 areas, beginning with fluency and coherence. We're thinking about how smoothly somebody talks, and are they talking about the question that's being presented to them? We're also going to look at lexical resource, so the vocabulary that's being used, the expression of language, the understanding of the appropriate words to use in the right situation. We're also going to be looking at grammatical range and accuracy, again, the range of sentence structures, the understanding of past, present, or future context, the use of modals, or the ability to understand how grammar is used in a range of different situations. And more uniquely, because it is speaking, we're going to be looking at pronunciation. Pronunciation, it can be a wide range of things. We'll look at those in a little bit more detail. But again, like the writing session, each of these 4 criteria are equal in terms of assessment. Neither one is more important than another, so it's a balanced approach. Okay, so for a speaking overview, we do know that there are 3 parts to the speaking test. We're looking from a simple part 1 with some informal questions to part 2. So sorry, part 1, we've got some simple questions on a familiar topic. We know that they're kind of very basic in range, but they're designed to try to get out the ability at the lower end. Part 2 is what we call a long term. It might be familiar because you're talking about a personal experience, but there might be some more abstract ideas. And here in part 2, we're looking at somebody's ability to keep going uninterrupted for a period of time. Part 3, the development moves into more complex ideas. It looks at exploring a candidate's ability to talk at length still, but also to maybe rationalize, to reason, to give an example, to add clarification, to think about an opposing idea, to think about justification for something that's been presented. So again, we're looking at these 3 things, but it's important to remember that the person's ability, the person's performance is assessed as a whole. Even those 3 individual parts, part 1, 2, and 3, neither one of those is more important than the other. There are 3 different skills that are being targeted, really. But for today's purpose, what we're going to do is focus on part 2. Like our writing session previously, we focused on a task 1 and a task 2 sample. Today, we're only going to focus on a part 2. So we are going to be thinking about scores and scoring, but again, it's a very narrowed window into a performance, and it's not really a whole final score. So here's our candidate card. We've got a task card that's on the screen in front of you. And this is very typical of something that you might receive in Ielts. Talk to a friend, talk about a friend who has played a big part in your life. You should say when you met, what your friend is like, and what is so special about him and her. It's important to remember that these cards, they often cycle through a familiar pattern. We might get something talking about a person, either a person familiar to you or a famous person. It might be about an event or a time, something that's happened, something, a special occasion. It might be about a place you visited, a place you would like to visit, a place that had a special memory, a place that's important to you. Or it might be a topic around a thing, something you would like to own, something you do own that's important to you, something that you have that has a special memory. So again, the context is around this long-term descriptive element. And as we can see, these are guiding notes for the candidate. When you met, what your friend was like and what was so special about him or her. These are just some prompts to give a candidate something to talk about. And one thing that some people often ask is, what if the candidate doesn't talk about all three things? Will they lose marks? Or if they don't get onto all of those points, would they would they have any more points distracted from them? So I want you to think about those things, and we will discuss that later. But right now, we want you to be listening and making notes. We're going to look at two samples, and we want you to think about the strengths and the weaknesses of each. So Erica, whenever you're ready, I'll hand the controls over to you.
All right. I'm just having an issue sharing the audio. Let me try that again.
In my opinion, as people get older and older, the less and less friends they have, because only real and the closest friends can stay with you forever. And I'm very happy to have such kind of friend in my life, and now I will tell you about her. Her name is, she is my university friend. We've been friends for more than 10 years. Coming to her character, I should mention her generosity. Beside this, she is very kind-hearted and hardworking person. Well, despite the fact that we live far from each other, we always try to keep in touch. Well, my friend has played tremendous role in my life, and now I will tell you why. When we graduated the university, I really didn't want to have a job as a teacher because I couldn't see myself as a teacher at that time. But encouraged me and gave me some advice on this issue. And so she is the reason of me being a teacher now. And we are both teachers now. We both teach general English and we are happy with our job. So I am very thankful to my friend for being my friend and for being the impact of my life.
I'm going to talk about my friend. I got to know her when we were studying at university together. She was sophomore student while I was freshman. We got to know each other through my friend that I studied together with. She is very sociable, a bit impatient, a very ambitious girl. I wish I could be like her, because she, every time when she decides to do something, she every time tries to achieve it. On the other hand, I'm not like that. Having her in my life as a best friend helped me to learn a lot from her. I learned how to be decisive, how to achieve my goals, and how to manage my time. She was also my friend that encouraged me to start the business. Well, actually, she was the one who was starting the business, and she offered me the collaboration. I made up my mind to agree and set up business with her, and I learned a great deal from her in terms of business. She reads a lot of books. She's a bookworm, and there is not a single book that she has never read. She's every time walking with a book in her car or in her bag, and every time, as soon as she finds the free time, she takes the book out of her bag and she starts reading it. And this also taught me to read books, learn from them, and putting what I learned into practice.
Okay, thank you for sharing that, Erica. Okay, so what we played were two samples, local samples. Some of you have already used the link that we provided in last session to take the time to review, listen again and again and again to those samples. And what we're trying to think about, like anything as a teacher or a trainer, is assess in terms of strengths and weaknesses. It's important, even without thinking necessarily about Ielts per se, it's important to think of how we assess somebody against the criteria. Try not to compare somebody to another person. So like the writing, we don't want to say that this writing compared to the other one is slightly better. Each time we're looking at something on its own strengths, its own merits, or its own weaknesses. So we did get a selection of responses. We are going to have a look at those. And what we can see here on the screen is, for the first sample, we got a range of input and ideas. Interestingly, we can look and see that for Fluency Coherence, for Lexical Resource, Grammar and Pronunciation, there was quite a big range. Some people up at the 8s and the 9s, some people down at the 4s and the 3s. But reassuringly, we can see that there was quite a strong grouping of results in the middle. Erica, any insight into these?
Yep, so for Fluency and Coherence, we can see that most people are straddling between that 6 and 7. So they're already picking up on some of that criteria for Fluency and Coherence. As you can see, Fluency and Coherence is here in blue. For Lexical Resource, again, we are grouping more towards the middle, with most of the scoring results being around 5, 6, 7, and a few a bit higher within the 8 range. And we'll look into these in detail in a moment, similar to what we did last week with the writing. Grammar tended to be a bit higher. As you can see, grammar is represented in purple, with most people scoring this sample a 6, 7, or 8 in terms of the grammar used in this part 2 sample. And similar scores were represented for pronunciation as well, more so in the 6, 7, and even in the 9 range. So again, as Mark mentioned, we don't want to contrast the samples to each other, we are looking at these audio samples according to the Ielts marking criteria. So let's go ahead and look at what scores we received for the second sample.
Interesting. So we can see a shift, which is reassuring.
Yep. We're still kind of conglomerating mostly towards the middle, but moving a little bit into that higher end as well. There are fewer scores represented 5 and below. With fluency and coherence, we can see that most people went up to a band 7 in terms of fluency and coherence. Lexical resource was a bit spread a bit more widely between 5, 6, 7, 8. For the grammatical range, again, we're falling more towards 6, 7, 8, and even 9. And pronunciation as well has a higher percentage of scores around that band 7, with a few at 6, as well as 8 and 9. So again, we're going to take a look at each of these samples according to the criteria, and we're going to highlight some of the features that an examiner might notice when marking these samples. So we're going to start with fluency and coherence. So at a band 5, according to the Ielts band descriptors, a band 5 can usually maintain a flow of speech, but a candidate at this level is going to rely on repetition, self-correction, slow speech to help them keep going. And this might be most obviously noticeable when they have false starts. So perhaps starting a sentence and then going back and having to reformulate it. They're able to answer the question, but it might take them a longer amount of time to do so. They might overuse certain connectives or discourse markers, so they might sound a bit repetitive as well. So they might have just learned a new connective and they're using it repeatedly, for example. They're able to produce simple speech fluently, but more complex communication causes some fluency problems. So the way we can think of this is if we think back to our first session with Dr. Matra, looking at those key differences between a B1 level proficiency on the CFR and a B2, talking about more familiar things that are personally relevant to you, such as perhaps somebody's physical appearance, like my best friend has brown hair, blue eyes, and she's a nice person. All those kind of concrete things I can talk about very fluently because they're very simple and more concrete. Whereas if I have to talk more about her personality or more abstract ideas, like she's very diligent and goes to work on time, that might cause some issues at the band 5 level. At band 6, the candidate is willing to speak at length, though they still might lose coherence at times, less so than a band 5, due to occasional repetition, self-correction, or hesitation. They're able to use a range of connectives and discourse markers, but not always appropriately, but it will be less repetitive than at the band 5. And looking at bands, at a band 7, the candidate is able to speak at length without noticeable effort. So they're able to just kind of speak without really having to think about what they're saying too much. Or there's no loss of coherence when the examiner in this case is listening to what they're saying. They may, however, demonstrate some language-related hesitation at times, but this is it's a rarer occurrence than at the 5 and 6 level. There is still some repetition and self-correction sometimes, which I believe we have in this sample. And they're also able to use a range of connectives and discourse markers with some flexibility. Again, if you think of last week and our writing session, that ability to be flexible and more precise with our language really comes across at that band 7 level. So let's go ahead and have a look to see how this applies to our samples. Now, again, just like in the writing, I don't expect you to read this transcript. We have just listened to this. This is the first sample that we heard. And if you did your pre-session task, it will be very familiar to you. However, we have just highlighted some of the features on the screen so that we can follow along.
So what we're noticing here is, again, this pausing element. Now, there's nothing wrong with pausing. People have to pause when they speak. And again, as a trainer or as a teacher, you don't want to force your students or encourage your students to just speak really, really quickly without taking any breaks, because that's unnatural. But what we're looking for is a difference between what's a natural pause to think about an idea. When somebody says, oh, why was it complicated? You think, oh, yeah, why was it complicated? Well, there's a couple of things. There's a natural pause while you're thinking about the topic. There's a difference between that and when we're pausing or searching for language. So I've highlighted a few pauses. What else have we got, Erica? If we just click onto the next part, what we're going to see is we've also highlighted a number of other smaller aspects when that comes through. Great. So, connectives, what can you tell us, Erica?
So some of these connectives are a bit unnatural. They do signpost what kinds of ideas are coming next, but they are a bit, sorry to borrow from last week's session again for the writing, but they come across as a bit mechanical. So in my opinion, as people get older and older, it's fine, but it just seems a bit like, you know, someone's kind of presenting a presentation rather than having a natural conversation. I'm very happy to have such a kind of friend in my life, and now I will tell you about her. Normally, if you're sitting and talking to a friend or someone you know, you're not going to say, well, and now I'm going to tell you about this, and now I'm going to talk about this. Perhaps you would in a very formal academic presentation, but again, that is a different style.
Yeah. It's also important to note as well that, you know, the notes that we see on the topic card, again, they're guidance notes. At lower ends, sometimes what we see is candidates tend to say, oh, who is this person? Well, this person is my friend. Why do I like her? Well, I like her because she's nice. What was special about her? Well, what was special about her was. So it's fine. It's fine at a lower end to use that as a way to introduce a topic. But a higher end, we're looking at for a range of discourse connectives, things like, well, you know, so, in my opinion, actually, personally speaking, all of those things, but they're going to be used flexibly.
Yeah.
And the final thing that we might look at, again, slightly different from writing, is these false starts or reformulations within sentence. So we've got a couple of times when the person is starting a sentence, but then they're having to restart it to kind of get across what they wanted to say, or to correct their English, or to correct the idea that they were thinking about. And again, it happens naturally in native speakers. You do it in your own language, we do it in our native language, but there is a distinction, there's a difference when people are doing it for developing a second language. All right. Now, in sample 2, hopefully you noticed that the person's overall fluency and coherence was stronger. Of course, the person had a pause here and there, but it was quite rare. And you notice that they had that strong willingness to speak. There's a difference between a 5, a 6, and a 7 in the overall willingness to speak and the ability to keep speaking. What else have we got? So we've got some slight pauses, but they are just content related. They're really just to focus on a precise meaning. What about the connectives, Erica? We've got anything there? Connectives, great. So what we can see is that the second speaker was using connectives, things like, on the other hand, having her in my life as a best friend. We got to know each other through my friend. So there's a storytelling rather than, okay, I will now tell you about her. There's a natural storytelling of like, well, I got to know this person through another friend that we studied together. So the connectives, the discourse markers are being used quite nicely to tell a story. It feels very fluent and natural. And there's a joining of sentences and ideas that make sense. Now, if we've got some things underlined, good, okay. There are some times when there's a reformulation, the person's restarting the ideas, but that's really to clarify a complete idea rather than just in mid-sentence when they're trying to think again what they're trying to say. So there is reformulation, but it's a more higher level reformulation where somebody's adding to that depth. And the other examples that they're using, this person, is very quick and very natural. All right. So think about those two in mind. We'll get to the scores later. But great, Erica, yes, we can go on to Lexical Resource.
All right, I do apologize if my connection is a bit slow, but we've got Mark here to jump in if anything happens. All right, so again, starting with band 5 for Lexical Resource. Again, we're looking at a band 5 is able to talk about familiar and unfamiliar topics with limited flexibility, similar to what we saw last week in the writing. They may attempt to use paraphrase, but with mixed success. And again, that comes across, as Mark was highlighting a bit earlier, where someone might be relying more on the task card for their vocabulary rather than coming up with it themselves. At band 6, they have a wide enough vocabulary to discuss the topic at length and make the meaning clear in spite of some inappropriate word choices. And they can generally paraphrase successfully, though perhaps not as fully as we would see at a band 7. At a band 7, again, here come those words of flexibly and precision in delivery of a message. And they're able to talk about a variety of topics. So at a band 7 for this sample, you might hear somebody just kind of go off and talk about their friend for a long time with no issue of where that conversation leads. Whereas a 5 definitely would be looking more at the card, kind of going in a list order, and a 6 would be somewhat in the middle of those two. A 7 is also going to use some less common and idiomatic vocabulary to show an awareness of style and collocation, which we saw in the sample, and I think we'll highlight again in the next coming slides. Although there are still some inappropriate choices. So again, even at band 7, we're not looking at perfect word usage, but there is an increased awareness of style. And they are able to paraphrase effectively. So, they're able to look at the card, note down their ideas, and then deliver that with no issues. So here's our first sample. We've highlighted a few of the repetitive words. The first word here is teacher, which granted it is on the topic, but in that short amount of time in the Ielts exam, it's very obvious that this person is using it repetitively and doesn't have that flexibility to use any other kind of vocabulary to get their meaning across. Mm-hmm. And we also have some other descriptive language here, Mark.
Yeah, we've got, so we have got that repetitive use, but now we're starting to see the person throw out some other words. We're using the character, generosity, kind-hearted, and hardworking. So that's nice because it's now pulling towards the kind of adjectives or descriptive language that show that it's beyond a basic level, which is good. These are the indications that we're looking for. We're trying to look for all the time evidence. As a teacher, like we would as an examiner. We're not trying to find fault and trying to say, that was wrong, that was awful, I don't know what you mean. All the time, we're trying to look for evidence of like, show me what you can do. Try to show me a little bit of evidence of higher level skills. So that's nice. That's what we're trying to look for. So there is some exemplification, which is good, maybe a little bit limited in range. There is a nice collocation. If we can go to the next one, I think we underlined something. We think we've got a third thing there. Yes, they played a tremendous role in my life. Now, this is the next thing that we're looking for, is putting together language chunks, collocations, really, that show that they know how to use nice set phrases or expressions. So, very nice. What about our second sample? Okay. Now, hopefully, as you're listening or as you did your homework, you notice that there's a higher density of language, as we would describe it. We've got really good, effective use of paraphrase. Also, we've got very good collocation usage. As you can see here, terms of business, put into practice, takes the time, tries to achieve it. So there's some nice things here. And beyond that, we've got other words like collaboration. Sorry if we can go back, Erica. We've got collaboration. We've got talking about the sophomore, freshman year, sociable, ambitious person. Everywhere you look, you're starting to get little chunks of language. Remember, there's something being described as a bookworm. So all the time, we're seeing more and more evidence of stronger language usage.
Yes, and I just wanted to add that here the language is more connected with the ideas being communicated. So in the previous sample, we had hardworking, generous, kind-hearted girl, but then it was more of a list of character traits rather than building into the story. And here in this sample, as Mark just mentioned, we have some samples of she's very, very sociable, a bit impatient, but very ambitious. I wish I could be like her because she's very decisive. And then it goes on to talk about how this girl is decisive, and it kind of links into that overall story. So it's a bit more integrated as well. All right, so let's go on to grammatical range and accuracy. Again, very similar to the writing criteria. A band 5 is producing basic sentence forms with reasonable accuracy. Now, this is a bit difficult because grammatical, the range and accuracy in spoken grammar is different to when we write. And even though we've transcribed these samples, it's kind of all just a guess of where those sentences begin and end. At a band 5, they're also limited in the range of more complex structures. And so this is going to be represented by those false starts and hesitations. And when those complex sentences are used, they usually have some errors and might require reformulation of the sentence, or they might cause overall comprehension problems for the listener. At a band 6, they're able to use more of a mix of simple and complex structures with limited flexibility. They might make more frequent mistakes with complex structures. However, the listener is still able to understand. So they're not impeding comprehension nearly as much as they would be at a band 5. And at that band 7 level, we get to see a range of complex structures with some flexibility and a frequent production of error-free sentences. So there might be some grammatical mistakes that persist, and sometimes these can be basic or something that's really hard and ingrained in the language learning process from later on. But they're able to make most of their sentences error-free and handle those more complex structures as well. So let's just have a quick look at that. Here's our first sample, and we've highlighted some of the grammar issues in sample 1.
Mm-hmm. So again, you're not expected as a teacher or an examiner to kind of be making notes of all of the grammar weaknesses or the strengths, but you are aware when something stands out, you think, oh, that's not quite right how he would say that, or something doesn't sit. Doesn't mean it's awful. It doesn't mean, even if it has no mistakes, we're looking for a balance of things here. So one of the things we noticed was this issue with modals and articles. So sometimes, even at very high levels, people can use quite simple mistakes. Issues with articles, a, the, it, things like that, or maybe modals. So what we can notice is sometimes if that mistake, is it just a one-off because somebody's nervous, or is it a recurring, is it a repeated mistake? And what we're seeing here is a repeated mistake. So it indicates that there's an issue with a certain grammar set. Something else as well, if we could click on to the next one, what else could we see? So what we had is very short sentences, and in some cases there was an over-reliance on a short sentence. Again, there's nothing wrong with a short, simple sentence because you might make a simple point. It was fantastic. The holiday, wonderful. But is it being done frequently? Is there a higher level of those? And in this sample, yes, there were. There were lots of short, simple sentences. Her name is this. She was a university friend. We've been friends for 10 years. Coming to her character, I should mention her generosity. All great, but if we're starting to see lots of simple sentences in a short space of time, it indicates that there is an over-reliance on them. Okay, if we look at our second sample, start us off, Erica. What could we see? Okay, sorry, you're on mute. Okay, so what we've got is maybe the occasional misuse of articles in this one. Not as much as the previous one. The word order sometimes has a few issues, things like she every time rather than every time she does this. And again, maybe not a higher density of stuff, but what we can see is sometimes this person has a little bit of issue with determiners, things like every time, and the order that they put them in. So again, we might notice that it's not a huge big mistake, but if she says she every time does, she every time goes, we notice that every time she does this, every time she goes. So it's just that one small issue with certain things. But there are some nice sentences. There's some long, complex sentences where we're starting to see clauses or added depth to them.
Yep. And as Mark mentioned, although that mistake is repeated, it does not impact the overall message. So again, the listener or examiner in this case can understand what the candidate's intention is throughout. So let's wrap up with pronunciation. I want to make sure that we get enough time for questions in later. Pronunciation is a bit odd because we look at 4, 6, and 8. And for pronunciation bands 5 and 7 fall in between those ranges. So at band 4, we're looking at a candidate that uses a limited range of pronunciation features. They attempt to control their features, but lapses are very frequent. Mispronunciations are also frequent and can cause a lot of difficulty for the listener. So a 4 is somebody who is really willing to speak clearly and intelligibly. They're probably still working out some of the basic phonemes of words, and their delivery might be a bit more robotic or mechanical or very textbook, we might say. At a 6, the candidate can use a range of pronunciation features with mixed control, and they're able to show some effective use of features, but this is not sustained throughout all the time. So if we think of fluency and coherence, again, we said that, let me go back. if we think of fluency and coherence, when they're talking about those familiar topics and those more simple grammatical structures, they're able to do so very fluently. And then when they get into the more complex language, they kind of fall apart a little bit. We can think of this similar idea with a band 6 in pronunciation. They're not sustained throughout. They may also have problems with individual words, and this might impede some clarity at times. And this might also be more related to place names or some of that more nuanced vocabulary. And then at a band 8, we're looking at someone that can use a wide range of pronunciation features. So different chunking of language, emphasis on word stress and sentence level stress. And they're able to sustain this flexible use of emphasis with only occasional lapses that might not sound 100% natural. They're easy to understand throughout their delivery, and any type of L1 accent will have minimal effect on intelligibility. And this is an important part in Ielts because accent is not part of the marking criteria. And this is a common misconception. People can speak with whatever accent they have, as long as they speak clearly and intelligibly, and the examiner can understand, they can get good marks in the area of pronunciation. So let's have a quick look at our 2 samples. This is sample 1, I believe. I don't think we have anything highlighted, actually.
Yeah, so with sample 1, there wasn't anything per se to say, oh, this was mispronounced wrong. And the great thing about pronunciation, like Erica said, it's not about accent. So we can look at individual things as a teacher. What we notice, though, is you can look at certain things like the tone and the chunking. If somebody's delivering something very flat or the intonation is not sustained, it's kind of very basic. So it's not necessarily, oh, because you mispronounced this word wrong, but somebody could have something very flat. Now, maybe that's through nerves or language. But if somebody's saying, it was an amazing holiday, I had the best time of my life, I can't wait to go back, it sounds like there was no emotion there. So it could be balanced off with other things. We could look at language chunking that Erica mentioned. So do you individually separate out each word, or do you group them together? Thinking about that, we're putting things into nice little chunks. So that's the other thing that we're kind of looking at. What about the second sample, Erica?
So the second sample did have nice language chunking and various areas of emphasis. There was just one issue with pronunciation that kind of stood out, which was some of the emphasis on the past tense verbs throughout.
Yeah. And again, it's just one thing that stands out. Now, again, it's a teachable moment. For ED endings, we have either a T sound, a D sound, or an id sound. So it's a small little issue. But for this sample, what we did have was that emphatic stress, when somebody could really emphasize parts of a sentence. There was nice syllable stress within individual words, like you can have collaboration, so that collaboration is a little bit more emphasized. There's a flow of speech. It sounds like that the person is speaking very comfortably and naturally, even if they have an accent or even if they have an L1 interference. Doesn't matter, because we're looking at all of those other things: syllable stress, sentence stress, contrastive stress or emphatic stress on things, chunking of language, intonation for meaning, intonation for inference. There's loads of other things that can happen beyond just an accent to kind of balance it all out. So when we looked at our samples, we thought about sample 1 going back to the grades, and we thought about sample 2 going back to the grades. Those people that did the homework and you kind of preempted or you kind of guessed what the scores would be. And again, it's important to remember, this is not the whole of a test. It's only a very small window. And as an examiner or a trainer or a teacher, you would use that as an indication. So sample 1, for fluency, coherence, lexical resource, grammar and pronunciation, Erica, it's indicative of what would you say?
Of about a 6.
Yeah.
Yeah, we would give it, they did not show the signs of struggling so much as a band 5. So it would be a nice benchmark sample for about a band 6 across all 4 criteria.
Yeah, and it's a really good one. It's a perfect fit for a 6. The student could go on to do a part 3 and show a much stronger range of vocabulary and grammar, perfectly fine. But in that small sample, they're hitting all of the things we would expect for a 6. The second sample, most people indicated or showed that it was stronger, which was reassuring, because for the fluency and coherence, the willingness to keep going, that short sample, the range of vocabulary that was stronger, the grammatical structures that were longer, even though there's a couple of minor mistakes, and that pronunciation, all of those other things, the stress, the intonation, the flow of the speech, this would be indicative of
about a 7 across for all criteria. Again, as Mark says, we would want to see how these candidates perform in part 3 to kind of confirm these score indications. But from the samples that we have, we can link some of these features with the criteria outlined in those public band descriptors.
Okay, so question time. So some people have already sent in some questions, and thank you for that. At the side in the chat, thank you to Dr. Joanna. She's been answering 1 or 2 questions. All right. Does Ielts speaking take into account speech impairments, for example, stammering? Erica.
Yes. Yes, so it is very important to know that all Ielts examiners go through the same high-level standard of training internationally, no matter where they are based. And Ielts, it aims to make a fair testing experience for all candidates. So if you do need any accommodations for your Ielts exam, it's very important that you reach out to your local testing center so that they have enough time to make whatever accommodations might be needed for your test. So that's very important to reach out to the testing center because various accommodations might need different lead time. The next question we had was, how can students practice speaking if they have no partner?
Oh, this is a challenging one because a lot of students, especially in this time, are faced with that. You know, we're in lockdown because of, COVID restrictions, but it's no different to when students had been in this situation before. One of the things you can do as a teacher or as a trainer or a learner is look at those criteria and set yourself like individual things as a learning target. Of course, you have to record what you're saying and review it. And one of those things might be recording and thinking, okay, is there something that I could have said better in terms of the language that I used, the word choices that I used, or are you going to work on just something like your intonation, your pronunciation? Maybe you can't remove certain accents, but I'm going to try to get that chunking of language together or get more emotion in my delivery and speech. And of course, yes, there may be no local partner, but online now, it's very, very easy to connect in very safe ways to connect on language learning forums. You can connect with partners all around the world, and you can do this for free. You don't have to be partnered with a native speaker. Anybody who's about your level would be a perfect opportunity.
Yep.
Okay. Go, Eric.
For the next question, I'm going to build on that as well. How can tutors increase students' confidence in speaking? I find in particular that when I'm actually the stronger learner, I enjoy tutoring others that might be a level below me because it forces me to use my language in a different way. For example, if I'm studying Spanish at a B1 in my textbook, I'm going to be constantly doing those B1 exercises, where if I'm going to help my colleague Mark, for example, at the A2 level, I'll have to be more flexible in my delivery and in my explanations. And that kind of adds to my own proficiency. And it also helps instill a level of confidence in my own abilities by being able to explain something to someone else. And it's just kind of nice. So I think that's a very good way to gain some confidence as well, and also offer another opportunity for authentic language use. We also had a question come in about, do you recommend using a PPF method in speaking part 2? And I'm very happy that this person explained what that is, because I've never heard of it, but it is past, present, future method in part 2. What do we think of that, Mark?
Well, I think anything where you can build in training activities are brilliant. Anything that can kind of encourage students to deal with unfamiliar topics, to practice like recycling language, and this past, present, future, anything that can help practice a range of grammar is perfect. Because yes, for training purposes, you want students to be able to comfortably, talk about the past, the present, and then maybe show the future. Great as a training activity, lovely things to get that build up in confidence. However, what we would also say is try to avoid forcing in things to exams when they don't fit. There's a difference between practicing so that you become familiar, that you know how to use it, and then just always forcing something into the exam. So if you're trying to force it in to like this topic we had earlier about a friend, maybe you could talk about the past, or maybe you could talk about the future occasionally. But if it doesn't really fit the topic, then there is the risk sometimes of when candidates are forcing in things just to try to score points when it doesn't necessarily fit. So great as a training exercise, but everything has to be used flexibly. That's the key. What are the requirements to become an IELTS examiner? Erica?
I'm testing my memory now. The requirements to become an IELTS examiner are available on your IELTS website, British Council website, as well as your local British Council website. You also need to have a CELTA certificate and 2 years experience teaching TEFL or TESOL to adults. And you also need to have a IELTS level 9 proficiency in both speaking and writing.
So I wonder, I guess maybe somebody was asking is it possible for a local person from Uzbekistan to become an examiner? And the answer is yes.
Yes, of course, absolutely.
Of course. It is not reserved just for, native speakers from the UK, from America, from Australia. All that's required is if you can just demonstrate that fluency in a language, then yes, you're qualified.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Advice on providing effective feedback for students. Well, Dr. Joanna, thankfully, has been answering some of that in the chat at the side. Hopefully, what we've shown you today is that giving feedback can be done very easily using these public banned descriptors. Even if you take something like a pronunciation, and you know that there's a load of features, there's loads of things, even within pronunciation, there's loads of little things that you can target. We can't do everything at once. You can't do fluency and lexical resource and grammar and vocabulary, but you can take each one of those things and focus or give some targeted feedback.
Yep. So unfortunately, that's all the time that we have today. We thank everyone for attending, and thank you for sending in your questions in advance. Thanks to those of you who have done the pre-session task and submitted your responses. That was very helpful, just to gauge where people were kind of thinking before we went through everything in detail. And thank you to British Council Uzbekistan for hosting this webinar series.
Thank you, everybody. Best of luck with the future.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.